Howdy guys, welcome to week 12 of Ecology and Society. This week we're going to be talking a little bit about biodiversity. My name is Elliot Foxley, and Jordan Rogan, Amanda Selnick, and Tabitha Amid are also featured here. So we found this project really insightful and hope you do too. So first off, what is biodiversity? In its simplest terms, you can look at it as just the variety of life. But a more technical term would be the biological diversity in an environment as indicated by a number of different species of plants and animals. So this is, illustrated by just having an abundance of different species and having a very diverse amount of animals and life forms. But there are different types of diversity, which we'll get to in the next slide. So there are three main types of biodiversity, looking at genetic diversity, species diversity, and ecosystem diversity. So genetic diversity is a variety of genetic makeup among individuals. So this is looking at brothers and sisters and interbreeding pairs and different closely related organisms as well as widely separated organisms, and hoping for a genetic difference and lots of different genomes and mutations and just having that wide variety of genetic makeup. Species diversity, on the other hand, is looking at a variety among species. So we're looking for lots of different species or distinct types of living organisms that are found in different habitats of the planet. Ecosystem diversity, however, is the variety of forests, deserts, grasslands, streams, lakes, oceans, coral reefs, wetlands, and other biological communities. So breaking it down, it's the diversity of ecosystems across the world or in the area that you're looking at, whatever it may be. It's the diversity of the ecosystems.
So we've talked quite a bit before about the idea of redundancy in ecosystems and in maintaining biodiversity, and how it's actually a good thing in this case. So it's basically different ways of performing the same function. It's actually the first principle of a resilient system along with diversity. So systems with many different components are going to be more resilient than those with less diversity. And this diversity allows for some components to compensate for the loss of failures of others. So basically a redundant, biotic or abiotic functional group increases response diversity. So if there's more variation in functional groups, it's going to be better. And essentially this promotes and sustains diversity in all forms. So systems that have several different components, such as many species, actors, sources of knowledge, they're going to be more resilient than those with less components. And this kind of leads right into functional diversity as well, which is just the same idea. And this provides insurance within a system by allowing some components to compensate for others if they're lost. So it's a really important component when we think about maintaining biodiversity in ecosystems, especially those that might be under some sort of stress. And then functional diversity, we've also talked about before in the resilience text. It's defined as well. So different functional groups of organisms that are represented in a system. So having more functional groups is also going to lead to having a more redundant system. So different functional groups do different things in an ecosystem. A range of species that provide the same basic service, though they go about their business in slightly different ways. So having different ways of responding as well, which is known as response diversity. So different species of the same functional group might respond to disturbance in different ways. So differences in the size and the scale components giving them varied responses to disturbance. So a variety of organizational forms such as government departments, NGOs, and community groups might overlap in function and provide a diversity of responses. And so in the resilience text, they kind of talk about this when they talk about balls bouncing at different heights. So having different responses of different organisms in the system. It's kind of the same as, I guess, different balls bouncing at varying heights. So if there's a large number of different response types, the service provided by a functional group is likely to be sustained over a wider range of conditions. And so then that system is going to be more resilient or have a greater capacity to absorb disturbances. So it's another component of biodiversity that's particularly important when we think about resilient systems. And this kind of leads nicely into one of the readings for today. So it's Elmquist, 2003. So his paper was specifically called Response Diversity, Ecosystem Change, and Resilience. So he talked a lot about the importance of response diversity and kind of stresses the essential link between ecosystem services, functional groups, and response diversity. Specifically, they focus in this paper on the role of response diversity in sustaining and enhancing desirable ecosystem states in the face of disturbance and human-induced environmental change, and they kind of highlight this cross-scale nature that occurs here as well. They look at the neglected but essential role of diversity within functional groups in the adaptive capacity of ecosystems. So remember we talked about adaptive capacity before, so that's the capacity of a system to adapt if the environment where the system exists is changing. So this is often determined by a genetic diversity of a species, and also, of course, the biodiversity of particular ecosystems. And they also emphasize the role of biological diversity in providing capacity for renewal and reorganization of desirable ecosystem states following change, and also preventing shifts to undesirable ecosystem states, so those regime shifts that we talked about before. And how this hasn't really been the focus of previous studies when looking at the relationship between biodiversity and ecosystem function. And so in this first figure here, figure 1 from the reading, they examine these kind of shifts specifically in coral reef and rangeland ecosystems from a more to a less desirable state as a consequence of human-induced erosion of resilience. So we've talked about that a little bit with the ball in the basin metaphor. The basin gets altered by disturbance to the point where a regime shift can occur if that basin kind of flattens out. So if the size of the attraction basin is small, resilience is small, and even a moderate perturbation may bring the system into the alternative basin of attraction. The actual shifts in coral reefs and grasslands are caused by disturbance events, which resilient ecosystems would have absorbed through reorganization supported by response diversity. So kind of looking at the idea of lacking response diversity might cause systems to shift or go into regime shifts into an undesirable state. The authors kind of also elaborate on patterns of species loss in relation to ecosystem functioning and response diversity. They then provide examples of the role of response diversity and ecosystem resilience in relation to disturbance and human-induced environmental change from both terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. And then they finish this paper by examining the temporal and spatial context of response diversity and a discussion of how to include this in management. So they talk quite a bit about the importance of ecological redundancy and response diversity. I don't want to beat a dead horse with this, but it's an important thing when maintaining biodiversity and resilient ecosystems. So they highlight that biological diversity plays a substantial role in ecosystem resilience and in sustaining desirable ecosystem states in the face of change. And this role is related to the diversity of functional groups in a dynamic ecosystem undergoing change. And the species diversity within these groups points to the importance of diversity in species and populations within those functional groups. And that helps to maintain ecosystem services. So basically, again, ecological redundancy. So in particular, they hold that the variability and responses of species within functional groups to environmental change is critical to ecosystem resilience, a property that we call response diversity, again, and defined as the diversity of responses to environmental change among species that contribute to the same ecosystem. So in the face of human-induced press or chronic perturbations on ecosystems, with the potential for compounded perturbations, it's required that functional groups of species remain available to ensure renewal and reorganization of systems in the face of disturbances. If not, this leads to that regime shift in an ecosystem to an undesirable state. So fragmented systems like the archipelagos generally seem to lose specialized species and have a disproportionately large share of generalist species. So the sequence of species loss following disturbances may have important implications for ecosystem functioning and the sustained flow of ecosystem services. The loss of specialist species may entail lower rates of ecosystem processes, and some functions performed by specialists may not be carried out at all. So, for example, the decomposition of particular substrates or the pollination of certain species. They kind of touch on these ideas. In systems where whole functional groups go extinct or become ecologically insignificant as a result of environmental change are characterized by low response diversity. So this is of particular importance when such functional groups contribute to ecosystem services that are essential for human well-being. So it kind of emphasizes the importance of functional diversity and response diversity and redundancy, not just for the systems themselves, but for those who benefit from them. So the authors talk about a couple different examples here, example systems, and I'll talk briefly about one example system. So this is the seed dispersers in Western Polynesia. So on islands in Western Polynesia, a large proportion of the tree species produce fleshy fruits that are dispersed by vertebrate frugivores. The diversity of species within the functional frugivore group has been substantially reduced since the arrival of humans. Many of these species have since gone extinct, with only one species left on the island of Mangaya and 6 to 8 species remaining on the larger islands. In Samoa, the majority of trees produce fleshy fruits that are consumed by 2 species of bats in the family Pteropodidae, which they call flying foxes because they're quite large. And these 2 that they refer to in this reading are Pteropus tonganus and Pteropus samoensis. And then 3 species of fruit pigeons and doves. So Columba vitensis, Dacula pacifica, and Tilinopus porphyraceus, I believe. And so these vertebrate frugivores show 60 to 80% overlap in fruit consumption. And in the early 1990s, cyclones and fires caused extensive damage and changes to the lowland forests, with colonization and regeneration limited by seed dispersal. So these frugivorous species, particularly those flying fox bat species, showed a striking difference in response to cyclones in behavior and in mortality. So while species such as P. tonganus, which is right there, and D. pacifica, showed greater than 90% reductions in population size. Others, such as P. samoensis, somewhere here, showed less than 10% reduction in population size. So they were much less affected by these cyclones. So basically, while previously dominant species declined drastically, other subdominant species were able to kind of fill in those gaps. So they were in the same functional group, and they were able to survive and maintain the seed dispersal functions. So they provided that essential response diversity that we keep going back to. And so basically, if this response diversity had been low or absent, ecosystem development may have been redirected into a different pathway, dominated by wind-dispersed and passively dispersed plants, which would provide a great risk of invasion by wind dispersal, or wind-dispersed exotic opportunistic species, and would have completely changed the system and the resource base for humans. And so next, they kind of talk about how interactions occur across scales. So we've talked about the importance of scales quite a few times as well. So that response diversity across scales exists through species operating at different spatial and temporal scales. Ecological disruption usually occurs across a limited range of scales, allowing ecological functions that operate at other undisturbed scales to persist. So it's really important to have those different scales where these different processes are functioning. So ecological functions that are replicated across a range of scales can withstand a variety of disturbances. They have greater resilience in these systems. So one example of that the author talks about is in Brazil's Maricá Island. So they kind of look at how palm seeds are dispersed across a range of scales by a variety of species of seed dispersers. So these range in size, from small rodents, which typically leave seeds within 5 meters of the parent trees, to tapirs, which are quite large animals, and they move seeds up to 2 kilometers. So having the difference of scales, spatial scales, in dispersing seeds on this island helps keep the ecosystem functioning and helps keep it more resilient to disturbance. And so seed dispersal of these multiple scales allows the palm population to persist despite a variety of small and large scale disturbances. Small scale dispersal maintains palm patches, while larger scale dispersal bypasses barriers at small scales to create new palm patches. And finally, they kind of finish off this paper by talking about how to manage response diversity. So they account for the role of biodiversity and ecosystem resilience for sustained social and economic development in formulating management and policy. So managing for resilience is critical for coping with uncertainty and surprise in a biosphere shaped by human action. So as we influence these natural processes in ecosystems more and more, it's really important to figure out how to manage response diversity in these ecosystems. So the author notes the importance of recognizing biodiversity and functional diversity in particular, as it is crucial when trying to enact proper management of ecosystems in a changing world driven by anthropogenic disturbances. Human homogenization of landscapes has altered disturbance regimes and eliminated entire functional groups of species, which we talked about is extremely detrimental to these ecosystems. So the persistence of these groups appears to help prevent shifts to ecosystem states that are unable to sustain the desired level of ecosystem services. So the author ultimately emphasizes that focusing on response diversity helps increase the effectiveness of ecosystem management. Ecosystems with high response diversity, remember, provide a buffer that ensures the system against the failure of management actions and policies based on incomplete understanding. And so this allows for managers to learn and actively adapt their resource management policies.
So this paper on coral reef disturbances provides an overview of coral reefs as a case study of how to study resilience to disturbance in a system. Typically, coral reefs are able to withstand varying levels of disturbance, ranging from small events, such as predation, to large events, such as hurricanes. Coral reefs used to respond to natural disturbances in a traditional looping fashion, as we have studied so far. While it is hard to pinpoint the exact cause for the shift away from coral reefs being able to respond effectively to disturbance, it is broadly due to humans, both directly and indirectly, especially because human disturbance occurs more frequently than natural disturbances would. Corals don't have enough time to recover, and often recovery is further inhibited by effects from humans. Studies are starting to show that the biodiversity of species in coral reefs play a role in determining how long it will take for reefs to recover. Specifically, it is not only about the number of species, but how species interact spatially and temporally. It is especially important to have functional diversity. The fossil record shows that coral reefs have been resiliently organized for thousands of years, and only recently have we seen phase shifts and loss of biodiversity, thus implicating human impacts on coral reefs. Coral reefs must be managed and studied at many different levels in order to assess the impacts humans are having and to determine ways to preserve the biodiversity in this group of organisms, which has evolved to depend on high biodiversity to maintain resilience. So now that we've continued to get a little bit deeper into biodiversity, it's time to take a little bit of a step back and just look at the connectedness among everything. So biodiversity is very much like a net. That's how you can visually picture it. All the organisms are woven together, whether they're plants or herbivores or carnivores, through various connections. It could be competition or predation or just all sorts of different factors that are moving and connecting them, and that's what holds the system together. Without those connections, there wouldn't be this ecosystem, there wouldn't be this biodiversity. And Pocahontas said it best as we are all connected to each other in a circle, in a hoop that never ends. So that's the great way to think about biodiversity in a simple term and just kind of put it all in perspective as we continue. So as we continue to look at connectedness, the most clear example is in a food web. So here we have just a forest ecosystem, and you can see very easily how it can be considered a net. Everything is woven together and connected in many different parts. You can see both functional diversity here. There's different functional groups represented. You kind of have to tease them apart because, again, it's all kind of woven together. But you can see the producers, consumers, top predators, they're all represented here. And additionally, because there's so many different representatives for each group, there is a response diversity. So the more interconnected and the more diverse the web, the better resilience these ecosystems have. And again, just to put it in perspective, over on the right, you can see that we are part of this. We are part of this web. And I think it's very simple to put together a little web here and exclude humans. But we play a big role in all ecosystems, and especially in sociological ecosystems. So let's keep that in perspective as we move on. So the big question we should always be asking ourselves is, why is this important? Why is biodiversity important to us? Yes, it is great in resilience and has all of these ecosystem benefits, but ultimately, what does it provide us as humans? So the main thing that we can put a dollar sign on, in a way, is the ecosystem services. So these are benefits that we gain from the environment, especially a biodiverse environment. Some examples are the provisioning ecosystem services, and these are going to be food, water, things that provide for us and keep us alive and healthy. Also regulating, so this is going to be pollination and water regulation and climate regulation, and just keeping everything balanced and in check, which is often probably, in my opinion, one of the least noticed ecosystem service. Additionally, is supporting, so looking at photosynthesis and nutrient cycling, and also cultural, so that's aesthetic value and just spiritual and religious values. So these are all things that ecosystems provide to us, but especially biodiverse ecosystems. A monoculture or a one provisioning ecosystem is not going to allow us to have all of these ecosystem services that a biodiverse ecosystem would. Additionally, and especially in socio-ecological systems, you need to have this biodiverse ecosystem in place because you need all of these different services to keep it functioning. So now that you have a firm grasp on what biodiversity is, it's important to know how rapidly it is decreasing. This graph focuses on only animal species and a great example of the decreasing rate. So in 1997, they collected a lot of data and they created that index. So that data was the 100 index. Everything less than that is an index less than 100. Anything above that, again, is an index over 100. And you can see that across the board since 1997, pretty much everything has decreased. And the data only goes until 2007. So you can just imagine how much more of a decrease we will likely see if we spread that out to 2017. The biggest gap, the biggest issue, is with already endangered species on the red list. The all species and all species on the red list is a little bit more constant, but as you can see, that is a universal decrease happening. Looking at hotspots next, you can see the global perspective and how big of an issue this really is.
A biodiversity hotspot is a region that is a significant reservoir of biodiversity and is threatened with destruction. As seen in this map, there are about 35 significant areas, and these have already lost at least 70% of their habitat. These may seem like a small area of land, that's about 2.3% of the world's land surface, but in these areas there are over 43% of the world's bird, mammal, reptile, and amphibian species. Specifically, these species are endemic to their biogeographic region, meaning that they cannot be found anywhere else in the world and are thus irreplaceable. Thanks for watching our presentation about biodiversity. Remember to do the readings, and the next slide has a couple links for YouTube videos about biodiversity for you to watch and gain further insight. Thanks!